Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today into thematic fraud risk assessments.
TFRAs.
Yeah, TFRAs, exactly.
They're super important.
Yeah, if you are at all involved in compliance or risk management or fraud prevention, this is something you really need to wrap your head around.
Yeah, a lot of folks get tripped up because they think a TFRA is the same as just like a regular fraud risk assessment.
Right.
It's not. Think of it more like this. Instead of looking at the entire organization for fraud risks, a TFRA really zooms in.
So it's kind of like using a microscope instead of just looking at the whole thing.
Exactly. And that's really important because fraud is not like a one-size-fits-all problem. Different parts of a business
Have different vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so procurement is going to be different than grants management, which is going to be different from payroll.
Okay, so I'm starting to see why that targeted approach is so important.
Yeah.
But how does a TFRA actually work? Like, what are the steps involved?
So there are 6 key steps to doing a TFRA. The first one is you got to identify the theme or the specific business area that you're going to examine. You need to really narrow it down. So let's say you're seeing some red flags in procurement.
Okay.
Boom. That's going to be the theme for your TFRA.
So you pick your battleground.
Yep. And then step 2 is all about engaging stakeholders. You can't do a TFRA in isolation. You have to talk to the people who are actually involved in the process that you're examining. These are the people on the ground who know the ins and outs of how things work, where the weaknesses are.
And they probably also know, like, what kind of fraud schemes might even be possible.
Exactly. And sometimes in those conversations, they'll actually reveal stuff that you just would never see in data or documents.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like I was once involved in a TFRA for a large manufacturing company, and we learned through stakeholder interviews that they had this big gap in oversight and procurement for certain raw materials. It turned out that one single employee could approve purchases from any vendor without any checks and balances.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it is, but luckily they caught it in time.
Oh, good.
But it really highlights the importance of talking to people and understanding the informal processes as well as the official procedures.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've identified your theme. You've talked to the stakeholders. What's next?
All right, so step 3 is where we get down to the nitty-gritty and assess the risks. We look at control weaknesses, at any past fraud that's happened, and even the organizational culture.
Wait a second. Hold on.
Yeah.
Organizational culture. How does that play into fraud risk?
Oh, it's huge. If you have an organization where people are always like bending the rules or there's this tolerance for cutting corners, that can be a breeding ground for fraud. Like imagine a sales team that's under pressure to meet their targets and they're only rewarded based on the sales numbers.
Right.
There's no regard for how they get those numbers.
Yeah.
That kind of environment, well, that can incentivize bad behavior, and make fraud more likely.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about the processes. It's also about the tone at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. You need that holistic view of the environment.
Okay.
And then that brings us to step 4. This is where we evaluate the impact and likelihood of the risks that we've identified, like which ones could really damage the organization and which ones are most likely to happen based on what we've uncovered.
So you're basically ranking the risks.
You got it. It's all about prioritizing.
It's like triage.
Exactly. You figure out which ones need immediate attention and which ones can wait.
Right.
And then once you've got that sorted out, we move on to step 5, which is designing and implementing some mitigation strategies.
Okay. This is where the rubber meets the road. So we've identified our risks. We've prioritized them. How do we actually address them?
So this is where we get creative and tailor solutions. We might need to strengthen controls, bring in some new technology for fraud detection, or maybe even redesign the whole process.
Oh, wow.
Training's also really important here.
Yeah.
You got to make sure folks are aware of fraud risks.
So it's about building a fortress around the vulnerable areas, but also empowering people to kind of be the first line of defense.
Yeah, and then the 6th and final step is monitoring and review. A TFRA isn't just a one-time thing.
Okay.
It's a living document. You need to revisit it and update it regularly because the fraud landscape, well, it's always changing.
Vigilance is key here.
Absolutely. You got to monitor those strategies, make sure they're still working, and be ready to adapt.
Okay. We've covered the basics, but I think it's time to talk about some best practices.
Yeah, let's dive into that. When it comes to best practices, I think one of the most important is specificity.
Okay.
It can be tempting to try and cover everything in your TFRA,
Right.
but that's really not effective or realistic.
Yeah.
It's better to focus on the areas where the risks are the highest and the potential impact is the biggest.
So kind of like Don't try to boil the ocean.
Exactly.
Focus on what's really important.
Yeah, make those strategic choices. Another important best practice is data.
Okay.
We've got so much data available these days, we don't have to rely on gut feelings and anecdotal evidence anymore.
What kind of data are we talking about here, and how do we use it?
It depends on the area, but it could be financial records, transaction logs, employee data vendor information, even social media activity. The key is to find data points that help you spot patterns or red flags,
I see.
things that might point to fraud risk.
So it's not just about having the data.
Right.
It's about being able to analyze it and extract meaningful insights from it.
Exactly. And there are a lot of tools and techniques that can help us do that,
Like what?
like statistical analysis, trend analysis, anomaly detection, even machine learning algorithms. For example, you can use statistical analysis to compare procurement patterns in different departments or to see if any vendors have weird pricing.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah, and even something as simple as tracking transactions that happen outside normal business hours or looking at how often employees override controls can be really helpful.
Oh, wow. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways to use data effectively.
So finding the right balance between sophisticated tools and, those more simple data analysis techniques.
Exactly. We also talked about stakeholder engagement already, but I want to emphasize it again.
Yeah.
You need to have the right people involved in the process, from start to finish.
So getting that 360-degree view.
Yeah. Management employees at all levels.
Yeah.
And it's not just about gathering info, it's also about getting buy-in. When people feel like they've been a part of the process, they're way more likely to support the recommendations.
Yeah,
It's a collaborative effort.
absolutely. What about documentation? Is that something we should be thinking about?
Oh, yeah. Documentation is key. You need to document every step of the way, from the planning all the way to the final recommendations.
Okay.
This helps ensure consistency and transparency.
I see.
And it creates a record that you can refer back to later, for future TFRAs or for audits and investigations.
So it's kind of like a roadmap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It also shows that you're being accountable.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about best practices. What about pitfalls? Like, what are some things that can make a TFRA less effective?
One of the biggest mistakes is using a generic approach, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Every organization is different. You can't just use a cookie-cutter solution.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Another mistake is forgetting about emerging risks. You can't just focus on what's happened in the past. You got to stay ahead of the curve.
So how do we do that?
Stay informed, read industry publications, go to conferences, talk to other professionals. There are a lot of resources out there.
Yeah.
And another big pitfall is lack of follow-through.
Oh, okay.
It's not enough to just identify the risks. You got to actually do something about them.
Right.
You need an action plan, assign responsibilities, track progress, make it happen.
Yeah, because it's easy to get caught up in the process and then lose steam when it comes to actually implementing the recommendations.
It happens all the time.
So how do we make sure that the TFRA is actually leading to real change within the organization?
You need a solid plan for follow-up, and everyone needs to know what they're supposed to do, and you need a way to track how well those mitigation strategies are working over time.
Okay, so thinking long term.
Exactly.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, and speaking of ongoing process, we should talk about leadership. Leadership plays a huge role in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like leadership would really impact how seriously people take the TFRA.
Leadership sets the tone. They create the environment where a TFRA can either thrive or completely fail. If they're truly committed to fraud risk management, it's going to show in everything they do.
So it's about walking the talk.
Yeah. They need to participate in the risk assessment, look at the findings, support the recommendations, and talk about the importance of ethics and fraud prevention all the time.
So leading by example.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
It's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up about fraud concerns, where everyone is responsible for managing risk.
That's a great point. Now I'm curious, are there certain industries where TFRAs are especially important?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like banking and finance, they have tons of financial transactions happening all the time.
Right.
So they're prime targets for fraudsters.
I can see that.
They need to be extra careful about things like money laundering and embezzlement.
Makes sense. The more money there is, the more attractive it is to criminals.
Exactly. And TFRAs can really help them pinpoint and address those risks. Another area where TFRAs are becoming super important is healthcare.
Okay.
With the shift to electronic health records and telemedicine, there are a lot of new vulnerabilities popping up.
Yeah, because it's not just about financial losses in healthcare. It's also about protecting patient data.
Right. A data breach could be devastating.
Absolutely.
TFRAs can help them find weak spots in their systems and put safeguards in place.
What about government? They're dealing with taxpayer dollars. Seems like the
Yeah.
stakes are pretty high.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They need to be super careful about how they manage public funds and resources. Fraud in government can really damage public trust.
So it's about more than just preventing financial losses. It's about being transparent, accountable, and responsible.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about maintaining the integrity of the whole system.
Exactly. And it's not just about the money, right?
Right.
TFRAs can also help government agencies deal with things like corruption and bribery.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about ethical conduct and good governance.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We talked about the steps involved in conducting a TFRA,
Yeah.
the importance of being specific and using data and involving the right people.
Yeah.
We talked about best practices and pitfalls, and we even looked at how TFRAs work in different industries.
It's been a really great discussion.
It has.
Hopefully everyone listening has a better understanding of TFRAs now and how they can use them.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that TFRAs are not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Definitely not.
You've said that over and over again.
Yeah, every organization is unique.
Right.
What works for a big bank might not work for a small nonprofit.
So how do you actually tailor a TFRA to fit a specific organization?
That's a great question. Yeah.
And it's something that a lot of organizations struggle with.
Yeah.
There's no easy answer, but there are some key things to remember. First, you need to really understand your organization.
Okay.
Like, what industry are you in? How big are you? What's your business model? What's your culture like? What regulations do you have to follow?
So it's kind of like knowing yourself inside and out.
Exactly. You got to know your strengths and weaknesses and what risks you're facing.
Right.
And once you have a good handle on that, then you need to think about your risk appetite.
Okay.
How much risk are you comfortable with? This is going to be different for every organization depending on things like their industry and their financial situation.
Right. Like a financial institution is probably going to have a way lower risk tolerance than like a tech startup.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And your risk appetite will determine how deep you need to go with your TFRA.
Makes sense.
You also need to consider your organizational culture.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a big emphasis on ethics and compliance?
Huh?
Or are things a little more relaxed? Yeah. That seems like it would have a huge impact on how vulnerable you are to fraud.
Oh, it totally does. If you have a culture where people feel like they can speak up if they see something wrong,
Right.
that's going to be a much stronger defense against fraud than a culture where people are afraid to say anything.
Yeah, where everyone's looking the other way.
Exactly.
So tailoring a TFRA is about looking at all of these factors together.
Yeah, it's about understanding your organization,
Right.
your risk appetite,
Your culture.
and then building an assessment that fits.
Okay, I get it.
It's like getting a suit made just for you.
Oh, I like that analogy.
It fits perfectly.
Yeah, it does.
Because it was made for you.
But I got to be honest, this all seems a little overwhelming,
Yeah.
especially if you're new to TFRAs or you don't have a ton of resources.
Yeah, I understand.
Where do you even begin?
That's why a lot of organizations work with experts who can guide them through the process.
Okay.
These experts, they have a lot of knowledge and experience. They know the best practices.
So it's like having a coach in your corner.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you have people in-house who can do this work,
Right.
it can still be helpful to get an outside perspective.
Sometimes you need a fresh pair of eyes.
Absolutely.
You know, we've talked a lot about the technical stuff today, but it seems like the human element is really important too.
Oh, it's crucial. At the end of the day, fraud is a human problem.
Yeah.
It's about people making choices.
Right.
And that means our solutions have to focus on people too.
So you can have all the fancy technology and procedures in the world,
Right.
but if you don't have a culture of integrity,
Yeah.
if people aren't willing to speak up,
You're still going to be vulnerable.
you're wide open.
Exactly.
Right.
That's why you need to invest in training and education. Make sure your employees know how to prevent and detect fraud. Give them the tools they need to make good choices.
So make them feel like they're part of the solution
Exactly.
instead of being part of the problem.
When people feel valued and informed, they're more likely to be on the lookout for suspicious activity.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that can make a huge difference in protecting an organization from fraud.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I hope so.
We covered TFRAs from every angle,
We did.
from the nitty-gritty steps to the human side of things.
Yeah.
And we even talked about how all of this connects to organizational culture and ethical behavior.
It's been a great conversation.
It really has.
I hope everyone listening feels like they can take what they've learned and use it in their own
Me
organizations.
too. And remember, TFRAs aren't just for compliance people or risk managers.
Right.
They're for anyone who wants to protect their organization from fraud
Absolutely.
and anyone who wants to build a culture of integrity.
Yeah, if you're feeling lost or you don't know where to start, don't be afraid to ask for help.
That's great advice. Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into TFRAs, I want to leave everyone with this. Think about your own organization. Is there an area or a department or a process that could use a TFRA? What kind of vulnerabilities are hiding just below the surface? What can you do to strengthen your defenses and make your organization more resilient, more ethical, and more resistant to fraud? Keep those questions in mind, and until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious.